of stop motion. King Kong, I'll never forget that. I'd always been fascinated with films ever since, because my parents loved to go to movies and they always took me. Images like that had never been put on the screen before. I didn't know how it was done, and that was half the charm of the picture. But my father knew somebody who had worked at RKO, and he told me about how it was done, stop motion. So I started experimenting in my garage. Willis O'Brien was an animator. He started really three-dimensional animation in America. So I called him up, and he kindly invited me over, because there were not many people interested in stop motion at that time. And then finally, when he started Mighty Joe, I had the great pleasure and advantage of working with Obie right from the beginning. I followed in his footsteps by making the characters a part of the picture rather than an insert from a situation.
So very ugly, and yet it seems so frightened.
And for example, the Ymir in 20 Million Miles to Earth goes right through the picture as a character, along with the live-action photography. And to use that old-fashioned word, glamorize them. You have to glamorize a dinosaur. But stop motion is a slow process, and you have to consider that when you're making pictures on a budget. And we had very tight budgets. I had a difficult time. I had to make my own way because very little was known about stop motion. I would say 95% of what you see on the screen is the first take. And sometimes when I sit in the theater and watch it, I cringe and say, oh, if I had only taken 10 minutes more or reshot that scene. Well, I destroyed Washington and destroyed Coney Island, and I destroyed San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. It got a little tiresome. So the next step was to find another avenue for the use of stop motion. It isn't everybody's cup of tea. It isn't good for every picture or every story. So I delved into the Sinbad stories, and he personifies adventure. And fortunately, it worked out beautifully. The first sketch I made was Sinbad fighting a skeleton. Now, if you had James Bond fighting a skeleton, you'd laugh at it. It would be comical. But a legendary character like Sinbad, you take it more as a melodramatic situation. It was ideal for stop-motion animation. Sometimes in our early films, they would criticize the actors.
Now will you get me a long wooden pole?
And one critic even said, Mr. Harryhousen should have animated the actors, which was quite pleasant to me, but not very nice to the actors.
Sinbad! Sinbad, help me! Help!
When the actors are rehearsed, it's either with a pole or with some stuntmen or something. And they never really see the finished product until the end. For example, in Jason and the Skeleton fight, we had 7 stuntmen who portrayed the skeletons. When I did the skeleton sequence, I thought, why in the heaven's name did I suggest 7 skeletons? Because animating one is enough to worry about. And the Hydra. Well, that was a little bit awesome. There were 7 heads on the Hydra, and if I went to answer the telephone, I would forget whether the 3rd head was going forward or backward. So I had to make notes, but I finally ended up not answering the telephone. We tried to keep it in the storybook tradition, and I think that's why they last, because people have a respect for the traditional stories that have lasted over the centuries, particularly Greek mythology. And I think it has a fantasy effect as well. Films were just made for fantasy, and that's what I have always stuck to.
Before there were computer effects, there was Ray Harryhousen. Our weekend tribute to the master of special effects begins Friday, June 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern, only on Turner Classic Movies.